and hello everybody joining us for this wonderful event for us to introduce Henry Mintzberg's new book, Understanding Organizations, Finally. My name, there's the book for you, everybody. It's really wonderful to have this opportunity to share with everybody. So my name is Philip Lanier. I'm going to be your host for today's event, and I'm going to be asking Henry these questions for all of you so that you can get to know more about Henry and understand what you will discover in Henry's latest book. Just before we start, I'd like to share a word from Coaching Ourselves. This event is brought to you by Coaching Ourselves. Coaching Ourselves is a business based out of Montreal, Canada, and we provide peer learning solutions for learning and development professionals in organizations so that you can launch peer learning programs to develop the leaders and the managers in your organization using our large content, our large library of peer learning content for your programs. If you are interested in learning more about Coaching Ourselves, my colleagues will put a link into the discussion or the chat on this event so you can discover our website. And for anybody that would like to try peer learning, we offer free public sessions for our community. The next one is on the theme of 70-20-10 with Charles Jennings, and he will explain to you how peer learning is a great component to your enterprise learning solutions. So, on to our theme today, Henry and his book. First, thank you very much, Henry. I've worked with Henry for decades now, and every time it's always a surprise as Henry continues to create new material, new ideas, and certainly new discussions for all of us to have around his insights and his perspective on the world of organizations, the world of our society, and how he views things, and all these sorts of things. Some of you, perhaps you're just discovering Henry and his work recently. So I'd like to start and ask Henry if you could introduce yourself for the people watching today that are just discovering your work. Who are you and what's important for you as a writer and a person?
I'm glad you asked that, Phil, because I always wondered, actually, I wonder who I am. So you might have to ask other people around me who I am, but I kind of see myself as a fairly ordinary guy who just likes to write and likes to write to reframe things. I get upset about people who don't think in obvious ways. I'm working on a little op-ed piece called "What is Dumbing Us Down?" You know, there's so much that's dumbing us down these days, and not just. I'm not talking about people on the fringes. I'm talking about people right in the heart of things who just don't get obvious things that are so dumb. So you know, I spent my life reframing things, my professional life, reframing things, reframing what managers do, the book in the corner, reframing how we develop managers, reframing organizations, reframing strategy as learning and not planning, and now reframing the whole issue of balance in the world. We're dangerously out of balance. And I got a website called rebalansingsociety.org. So an ordinary guy likes to canoe and snowshoe in the winter and reframe things in my basement looking out at the same lake.
Excellent, thank you. So in this book, Henry, which I read just in the past couple of days, and I really enjoyed it. You cover a broad array of themes, and you seem to weave together many of the ideas that you've introduced to us in the TWOG, or your blog that you have on your website. But as I mentioned to you earlier, you put these together in a way that we see them in the broader context with organizations sort of as the overall theme. Could you start by perhaps telling us, this book is a revision of your very successful book, Structure in Fives, that you released in 1983. What led you to write the first edition of this book all the way back in the 1970s and 80s? And then what led you to revise it and update it 40 years later? Or perhaps should I say, what took you 40 years to revise it?
Wait, there's a lot of questions, there. So when I graduated with my doctorate and started teaching in management in the area that used to be called policies, now called strategy, I started writing a textbook of different subjects: managerial work, strategy, structure, that kind of thing. And each was meant to be a kind of synthesis of that field. And the field of structure at that point struck me as all over the place. Huge amount of work, more than now, in a sense, huge amount of work, but not integrated, not consolidated. So I wrote the original book in 1979, and then I did the shorter version called Structure in Fives a few years later. And it was built around basic forms of organizations. And we'll get to what those are later, because the new book, which is called subtitled Structuring in Sevens, looks at much the same thing. Why 40 years later? Well, I've been spending a lot of time canoeing and hiking. You get busy. Actually, it's an interesting question, because the book had been, and in some places still sells in translation extremely well. But for about 10 or 15 years after I published it, was really successful through Europe and a lot of other places. Not in the States, because the publisher screwed up and it never got the right attention. But in Europe, and especially in Europe, and in French, for example, Structure et dynamique des organisations has been a huge seller forever. But somebody wrote to me, ironically, while I was working on the new edition, and said, "I love your book. I've been using it in my high school class." It's not a bad idea. I think everybody needs to know about organizations. I'm using it in my high school class. When are you going to do a revision? He was using a 35-year-old book or something when he wrote to me. So I guess I just kind of reached the point where I thought I could kind of bring it together better. And the main purpose of the book is as it opens, is really, we need to understand organizations. We all live in organizations. We're born in organizations. We're buried by organizations. We're entertained. We're harassed by organizations with robocalls and from phone companies or whatever, and so on and so forth. We understand ourselves, and if we don't, we go to a bookstore and can pick 35 books on ourselves. We understand the economy, or at least we can find 10 articles or let's say 3 articles in every newspaper and blog. But in between, we don't understand organizations. We mix them all up. A very prominent professor at Harvard Business School referred to hospitals as focused factories. She was the healthcare person at the Harvard Business Review, and she referred to hospitals as focused factories. Is that where you want your baby delivered, in a focused factory? So we mix them up. We mix up bureaucracies with professional organizations, for example.
And when you start the book, at the beginning, you start by introducing what you call the building blocks of organizational design. Could you sort of introduce some of these building blocks upon which, I guess, then the latter parts of the book are based?
Well, the most important building blocks are what I call, in both books, earlier and now, the coordinating mechanisms. That structure is essentially about division of labor. An organization is a group of people, each of whom has a particular task to achieve a common purpose. Okay, so different people in a manufacturing firm, some design the product, some manufacture it, some sell it, and so on and so forth. So division of labor is central. But then coordination becomes key. You can't have just a bunch of people doing separate things with no coordination. So to me, the basic coordinating mechanisms, and that comes from the earlier book, but better expressed now, perhaps, is one I call mutual adjustment. It's 2 people going down the rapids in a canoe, and they're adjusting to each other's motions. Nobody's in charge, but when the guy in the front does something to avoid a rock, the guy in the back has to do something to straighten the canoe out. So that's mutual adjustment. 2 workers communicating with each other, 2 engineers talking to each other. And then there's direct supervision. If you got 8 people in a rowing scull, then you can't coordinate by mutual adjustment. So somebody has to call the shots. So you have direct supervision. And the other forms are all forms of standardization. We standardize our work. McDonald's standardizes me when I buy a hamburger because they've got me trained to clear the table. That's a form of standard. Everything in McDonald's would be standardized, right? I mean, how many seconds till you turn over the hamburger patty and all that, but also programming the customers. Everything's programmed and standardized. Professional organizations where you coordinate through standardization of skills. So an anesthetist and a surgeon in a hospital don't talk to each other during an operation, and yet they're doing this incredibly coordinated, complex thing because they know they're trained through their education and on-the-job training to know exactly what to expect of each other. So that's standardization of skills.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's standardization of outputs. This is scheduled for 60 minutes, and at the end of 60 minutes, we end. That's standardizing outputs. Or telling a division manager, please cut costs by 10%. You're not telling him how, you're simply telling him or her what goal to achieve. And then there's standardization of norms, values, beliefs. So if you work for the Jesuits, not work for, but if you are a Jesuit, then you're trained in the norms of the Jesuit society and you conform to their norms. So that's how they coordinate your work. And these lead to, well, we'll come to that later, but and then all the other building blocks about, things like grouping. How do you group people? Do you group them by the in functions like marketing and finance, accounting? Do you group them by outputs like product A and product B and product C, and so on and so forth?
And as you were just alluding to, so then that leads to these, I guess, these fundamental forms of organizations that you're talking about and you define in your book. These various forms. Could you introduce the what is a form of an organization, how you articulate it, and perhaps what are some of these fundamental forms that the terms that you use?
So a fundamental form of organization is something that doesn't exist. Okay, that's the first thing to understand, in the sense that it's an extreme statement. No organization can be a pure form. But the thing that's surprising is how close to the pure form so many organizations are. So the basic structure is 4 of them, and I call them programmed, professional, project, and personal, or I have more elaborate names: the personal enterprise, the program machine, the professional assembly, and the project pioneers you mentioned earlier. And they're basic forms of organizations, but they can vary. People do it. So let's take restaurants, okay, as an example. Then we'll do sports, much more fun. But let's do restaurants, okay? So a programmed machine would be McDonald's, fast food. A professional assembly would be a hospital, university, in the sense that people work independently of each other. The surgeon and the anesthetist are working very closely, but they're actually working independently of each other, in the sense that they can, the same as professors in the university. Each one does his or her thing quite independently of each other, but there's a kind of coordination built in what they accomplish together in the university. So if I teach strategy and somebody else teaches marketing, the student graduates by understanding both. And then the project pioneer, an example of the project pioneer would be catering. An example of the professional assembly would be a gourmet restaurant, as opposed to a fast food restaurant for programs. Professional programmed is fast food, professional is gourmet dining, project is catering, where it's a one-off, customized, and a restaurant that's a personal enterprise would be the corner diner where the boss is all over the place. But more interesting are sports, because I tried to match a sport, and it worked very well with 3 of them. We had trouble with the 4th, but works very well. American football, it's actually North American football because it was invented at McGill, my own university in Canada. But football is the ultimate program machine. Everything's lined up, rules galore, who can catch the ball, who whoops. I don't know. Who can catch the ball, who lines up, and you know, even the cheerleaders line up. The quarterback is in charge, or the coach is in charge, and maybe radios in the play to the quarterback. But everything is absolutely utterly programmed. The professional organization is the one where everybody plays separately, but together. And a double play, baseball to me is that sport. A double play is a perfect example of the same thing as an operation in a hospital. The second baseman grabs the ball, flips it to the shortstop grabs the ball, flips it to the second baseman, who throws it to the first baseman. It's absolutely completely sort of worked out. Everybody works independently, but hugely skilled, very, very skilled kind of activity. And the project pioneer is hockey, basketball, rugby, and soccer, or European football, or Brazilian football. The interesting thing there, it's very tight teamwork. Look at rugby, where they form the scrum, or a very, very tight teamwork. But every time the puck or the ball is in one end and the offensive team is taking it out, it's like a new project. Nobody knows what's going to happen. When they call the play in football, the offensive team knows what's supposed to happen. But when they pick up the puck in hockey, nobody knows how it's going to unfold. The joy of it is you don't know what the hell is going to happen. And then we tried to figure out, so it's project sport. And then we tried to figure out what is a personal enterprise. And finally, we came up with a perfect example, which is World Cup yacht racing. Don't forget, we're talking team sports. We're not talking individual sports. So in World Cup yacht racing, the person who perhaps owns the boat, helps to design the boat, skippers the boat, and so on. It's all kind of, the other people are important, but one person is really, really in charge. So those are the four basic types.
I'd like to build on this project pioneer form, because when I was reading the book, it was great to see you talk about this idea of a project pioneer form. And I don't believe that was in your original book 40 years ago. This is a new form that you introduced, I believe. And you also state that we live in an era of adhocracy. This concept of adhocracy is key to the project pioneer form. And for everybody listening, the project pioneer form could be termed network organizations or spiderweb organizations or these sorts of things. Could you tell us a bit more about what is adhocracy and why is it key, if you wish, to the project pioneer form, which, as I understand it, is describing many of the new organizations that many of us work in, the sort of I guess the Googles and aspects of these big tech companies and these sorts of things.
Yeah, it's a new label, and it's a new and updated description. It was actually under the label of adhocracy in the earlier book, but not project pioneer. That's the word I'm using now. So it's a better description and a more thorough description. There was a finding years ago, a guy named Stinchcombe came to the conclusion that structures often reflect the age of founding of their industry. In other words, if the automobile industry grew up in the early part of the 1900s, then the structure they use today is similar to what became popular at that point. And of course, it's the machine form that became so popular with the Industrial Revolution into the early part of the 20th century. Then the professional form became quite, not to exclusion of the other, but in addition, came in and so on. That works for the project pioneer in the sense that almost every industry that grew up, say, from the middle or late 20th century into the current times, most of them, or almost all of them, use a project pioneer structure. In other words, they use projects, they use teams, they're flexible, they move around, they're not very hierarchical, and so on and so forth. Adhocracy, the labels I have for the four are adhocracy for that, bureaucracy for the machine, meritocracy for the professional, and autocracy for the personal.
Right.
Adhocracy basically means everything is kind of ad hoc. Once a project is done, something new comes along, like a very creative consulting firm or design house like IDEO in California, just one project after another, all starting fresh. So in a sense, if the machine organization was the product of the earliest industrial revolution through to the early part of the 20th century, then the project organization is the organization of our age. Certainly one exception is the airline industry, which is more machine than adhocracy, and that grew up in the 40s and 50s and so on, or 30s, 40s, 50s. But it doesn't, and if you start a new automobile company today like Tesla, you don't organize it as an adhocracy. You're not going to mass produce cars where each one is a one-off customized car. People do that. Who is it, McLaren or somebody? I don't know. So there are automobile companies that work as adhocracies and assemble them individually, but it doesn't pay to do that. It pays to have mass production and so on. One interesting thing about this is that if you automate a machine, let's say you can take everybody in an automobile plant and automate everything from beginning to end. You convert the organization into an adhocracy because nobody is doing routine work anymore. It's the engineers who are designing the robots and the people who are maintaining the automated equipment who are the key to the organization, and they're working on in a project basis. So if you can automate a totally bureaucratic machine, you turn it into an adhocracy. Suddenly it's all about designing and maintaining and not executing, because it's not people who execute. Machine organizations are what they are because many, many people are executing highly programmed, rather unskilled work, like the people work in a fast food restaurant.
Right. So interesting. So in the book, you start with your building blocks. Then you introduce these four forms of organizations that don't exist, as you mentioned. And then you, in the book, you start to talk about the variety of forces that are inherent depending on the form and various other aspects. Could you tell us more about these forces and how they relate to the forms?
Yeah, and that brings us back to a loose end here, which is why don't they exist?
Right.
And I'll explain it through the forces. So for each form, there's a force. So the machine form is concerned with efficiency. The professional form is concerned with proficiency. The project form is concerned with collaboration, and the personal organization is concerned with consolidation. I forget the word I used in the book. If you do nothing but efficiency, we've all run into organizations that are hyper efficient, and they do nothing but efficiency, and we don't go near them because they're crazy. They're crazy. So you can't be a pure machine form with nothing but efficiency. You need some innovation in a form of adhocracy. You need some skill for certain employees, maybe the accountants or whoever it is. So you're never a pure form. You have to be. If you're a pure form, you're going to go out of control. The physicians, sometimes you hear physicians talk about the operation was a success, but the patient died. This is a professional form, out of control. It's kind of like they've lost touch with what they're really trying to do. So you've always got to temper the main force, and the an entrepreneur. I mean, we got a perfect example of this in Twitter. right now, because Musk is trying to run it like a personal enterprise, but it's an existing established organization, and you can't have this hotshot going off in every direction. It might have worked better when he was in Tesla, but at least in Tesla, he was focusing on business he knew, which was building cars, or learned to know. But the way he's managing Twitter, which is essentially largely machine, somewhat professional organization, he's trying to run it like a personal enterprise, and it just doesn't work. So those are the four main forces, and then I add three more forces, right? And there's the force for pulling together. I call it culture. Everybody calls it culture. The force for pulling apart, which I call politics or conflict, and the force for separating into different units, like a divisionalized company that has divisions for different businesses. So we have three more forces, and the seven forces become the whole interplay in designing organizations. And those three more forces give rise to three more forms: the divisionalized form, when they're separated; the what I call the political arena, where everything breaks down in politics, which I claim can sometimes be constructive. If the organization needs radical change and it's not coming, it could be politics that drive it to change. And the communityship. I use the word communityship for a long time as one word, which means sort of very strong culture, very strong community. So I called the one that's based largely on the force of working together, I call it the community ship. So a monastery is a community ship. It's offshore. It's away from people, but it does one of two things: either it isolates itself from everybody else, or it lobs these shells into the shore, like a monastery that becomes a missionary organization, tries to convert everybody. That's kind of lobbing its ideology into other places. So I call them community ships. They're offshore, they're isolated, but they may try and connect.
So, and the communityship, as you know, is near and dear to our hearts at Coaching Ourselves, and to many people these days as we're trying to understand what we can do to help make the world a better place. But before that, I want to mention to everybody listening to us, one of the things that I really, really liked about Henry's book is the way he brings all these different ideas that he shares with us on his blog, and he brings it together in this narrative that's fairly a good read. It's lots of information, so it's not a light read, but it's unbelievable. And Henry talks about many different things that are really interesting and very different, but seemingly all pulled together. And so, Henry, you just spoke about conflict as one of these forces in the organization, and in that chapter you expand on the idea of politics in organizations and political games in organizations. And just so that everybody could hear, I'd love it if you could just share some of your thinking around politics in organizations, and obviously how it plays a positive and negative aspect to this force that we see in certain organizations, certainly more so than others.
Okay, so I have a friend in the U.S. in Boston area called Jeremiah Lee, and he knew the earlier book really, really well. Before he met me, he was just very influenced by the previous book, Structure in Fives. So he was helping me think through, and he said, Henry, you do all these syntheses. You did one book on a synthesis of managerial work, and you did this book on a synthesis of structure, and the Manager's Non-MBA is a synthesis of management development, management education. Where's the synthesis of the syntheses? So I decided to work that into the book. So there are sections in the book that talk about managerial work in the different forms and strategy in the different forms. And they're very different. In a machine organization, you may plan strategy, but you're not actually planning strategy. You're planning the details of strategic positions. You're not creating new strategy in a machine organization. It's built in, but you're adding, McDonald's can add new products all the time without changing its basic strategy. So you keep adjusting the strategy, whereas in project pioneer, strategy is absolutely about learning, and you never know what's coming next. And some new kind of far-fetched idea out of a project can change the whole organization. So I wrote the book as a synthesis, and I built in the idea of culture and the idea of conflict. And what you're asking about and I have a whole section on political games in organization, insurgency games and staff versus line games and lording games where you lord your authority over other people or over your customers, and all these different games. And I conclude in that area, in that section, that politics, which everybody thinks of as highly negative, of course, it's wasteful. I mean, you didn't build an organization to fight with each other. You built an organization to get something done, to build cars or educate students or whatever it is, play hockey, whatever it is. You don't want to fight with each other. On the other hand, politics can actually be constructive sometimes, because when an organization gets really out of hand, let's say a machine organization's gone completely crazy with efficiency, so nobody wants to go near it. It's so efficient, nobody wants to go near the place. It's impossible to deal with. A librarian who won't let the books out because somebody might steal one, you know. And sometimes it takes politics to force out the authorities who are supporting this. So you have the political games, like an insurgency game, comes in to force out the management that's screwing the place up. So politics can be very constructive in organizations. You know, you add all this together and you've got kind of understanding organizations.
Yeah, it's really well done. So the other, to continue a bit on the discussion of communityship that you introduced as one of the more forms in the book, the thing that I found very illuminating when I was reading your description of communityship is that it helped me better understand this concept of communityship that you had introduced several years ago under the umbrella, and this sort of concept of communityship as something that's, let's say, similar to leadership but more inclusive and has a more we definition than an I definition.
Yeah.
And in the book, you introduce community-ship as one of the forms of the organization. Could you tell us sort of these two concepts, communityship as it relates to leadership, how that might be similar to communityship as a form of the organizations?
You know, I've often been not an opponent of leadership, but just kind of had enough of it. You know, everything is leadership, and you got this really stupid idea that leadership is somehow superior to management. Leaders who don't manage don't know what's going on, just like managers who don't lead are boring to everybody else. Leadership and management are part of the same thing. You can't separate them. You don't want leaders who don't manage. And you've got to be in touch. You've got to know what's going on. But you know, you can't take 3 steps without hearing the word leadership, and it's just too much. Say the word leader or leadership, and the focus is on one person. Okay, we may not realize it, but when we say leader, we mean an individual. We could talk about group leadership, but we don't think of it that way. We think of it as individual leadership. Even if we say that Albert Einstein was a leader in physics, he's not a manager, he wasn't a manager, but still focusing on the individual. And if you're going to understand organizations, the first thing you're going to understand is it's collective. Organizations is groups of people trying to get something done, coordinating with each other to accomplish something. And so communityship is more important in general than leadership, or at least leadership has to serve communityship. Part of the job of leader managers is to serve the people who are going to work together and collaborate and coordinate to get something done. Now, the role of leadership management varies in each of the forms. So in the personal enterprise, it's obviously more important because we're talking about entrepreneurial organizations, or we're talking about turning around sick organizations where one person has to be more fully in charge, like the skipper, like the person who owns the boat in a World Cup race. Obviously, there's a lot of leadership there, but there's still communityship there. The crew has to be engaged and encouraged and working together. If you go to a project pioneer organization, leadership is less relatively important than working together. It's how the teams function together and how they function with each other. Some organizations are one big project, like a like a moonshot or something. Of course, it's one big project, but it's made up of many projects. But other organizations, like consulting firm that does different sort of contracts, ad hoc contracts, is very much a project organization where each project is separate from the others, but they still have to find ways to work together in some respects. So I put communityship ahead of leadership, at least in the other forms, not so much in the personal form. You know, in a hospital, it's not about leadership. It's about how they function together. And as I said before, a lot of that is kind of automatic, but that kind of coordination is absolutely key. And the great hospitals have a sense of pride and belonging, strong cultures. That's communityship.
Right. Right. And I very much appreciated in the book some of the references you had to sort of faith-based organizations, because it's very easy to understand communityship in a faith-based organization context as to why everybody is there and how this relates and keeps people together. To take it to another theme in the book, you have a wonderful chapter where you talk about the life cycle of organizational forms, and you also discuss the idea of the need for organizations to perhaps renew themselves, and for organizations, as with everything else, to have, you know, a beginning and an end. And so you make this statement, you say, a healthy society maintains a steady flow of fresh, new organizations to replace its exhausted old ones. It is not the renewal of single organizations that should concern us so much as the renewal of our society of organizations. Could you elaborate on that a bit more, your thinking on that?
Yeah, you know, when a government intervenes to save a great big organization because it's too important for employment, that's awful. That's awful. The organization is dead. Let it die from a stroke or a heart attack instead of a cancer that just drags it out and drags it out. How many organizations, look at, I don't know, like Sears or whatever, I don't know, organizations that just, or JC Penney, I don't know, I don't want to name something that's not dead yet, but organizations that take years and years and years to die. Why don't they just have a quick stroke and we get rid of them? And we can recycle their resources and recycle the human beings, not human resources, I don't like that term, but human beings, you know, and 10,000 new startups is a hell of a lot better than one old, sick, gigantic organization. And so we've got to keep recycling in a way, you know, and the cycle starts with entrepreneurship, whether it's business entrepreneurship or what's called social entrepreneurship, not-for-profit businesses, but same idea, and there's more and more of those. That starts with a personal organization. And then maybe it becomes, if it's in mass production or mass service, maybe it becomes machine, or if it's professional, it'll become professional, or if it's project, it'll, you know, Apple was created by Steve Jobs, and his role as an entrepreneur was huge. But of course, Apple was a project organization. So it early on, it was, as long as Jobs was there, it was a hybrid of a very effective personal organization with a very strong project organization. And after Jobs goes, it becomes maybe only a project organization. But you don't see that entrepreneurship and those ideas coming out of Apple now. That Jobs was an impossible act to follow. So you know, so you become another one of the other forms. Maybe you try and turn around, and there's a section about how you turn around these different organizations, how you correct them when they get sick. But eventually they've had their day. And then if natural forces can't get rid of them, then it takes politics to get rid of them. They get challenged politically, either because the whole place collapses into a political arena that drags itself down, or else people in the organization, act politically to change the place dramatically.
Thank you. Another section of the book, in fact, frequently, I wouldn't say frequently, but occasionally in the book, you articulate these ideas of certain aspects of management that contaminate our society, or you talk about, the social impact of different forms and these sorts of things, and especially as it talks about the measures and the measurement that's going on. So there's this quote, this statement that you make. You say, this is around the divisional form of organizations. You say everything that businesses, as well as governments and NGOs do, has social as well as economic consequences. The more their managers are controlled by the measures, the greater the likelihood that they will be distracted from the social consequences of their actions. And you say this is how the divisional form will drive managers to be socially unresponsive, if not socially irresponsible, the greatest problem facing our world of organizations today, or one of the greatest problems facing our world of organizations today. Could you expand on your thinking around all of that to share with everybody listening how you see this happening?
Yeah, if you'd like 5 perfect examples of that today, in today's newspaper, just open and read it. Okay, whether it's Musk, who's screwing up Twitter monumentally by all this number stuff, like firing half the staff. How the heck does he know who he should fire and who he shouldn't fire? All this stupidity about managing through the numbers. This idiotic statement that if you can't manage it, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's nonsense. That's absolutely nonsense. Many of the most interesting things can't be measured. Who measures the performance of managers? Who measures culture? Who measures innovation? So we've got to get off this. An obsession with numbers just dumbs us down. Okay, it just constantly dumbs us down, and because every measure is flawed. Doesn't mean don't measure. It means be very careful about what you do measure. In universities, we count A journals. A journals are the most prestigious journals in the field. And in order to give people tenure, we count their publication in A journals. So we had a situation where there were a bunch of professors who were trying to figure out how to give bonuses because the university is so decentralized. It was the professors making recommendation to the dean rather than the dean themselves, and how do you decide how to do that? So they said, all right, we'll give 1 point for every publication, 3 points for every publication in A journal and 1 point for every book. It took me 3 years to write this book. Okay, I'm going to get 1 point for this. You know why they want 1 point for this? Because they don't know how to measure its impact. But if they designate an A journal as wonderful, then they can measure the number of A journals. They're not assessing the quality of the articles. Presumably the journals do that. They're just counting the publications. Everybody does that. Business is loaded with that. And it's awful. It's awful to run a company or any other organization by just measuring and being obsessed with the numbers. Yeah, know what the numbers are, but then get past them. That's why conglomerates fail for the most part, because they manage through the numbers. The conglomerates, let me tell you a little story that's in the book. A guy named Thorne put together a little conglomerate. It was big, but only 3 businesses years ago in England, and I consulted a bit for them. And the 3 businesses were his lighting business, Thorne's original lighting business, EMI, the record company, the recording company, and a software company, as I recall. Okay, so they have 3 businesses, truly conglomerate, truly separate. And when I went in there, Thorne had died. And somebody said to me, ever since Thorne died, nobody knows how to run this place. And the reason is you can't run a conglomerate except as follows. The way you run a conglomerate is you pick good businesses and you pick good people to run those businesses, period. Period. Get off their backs about all the measurement. If you don't like them, fire them, but let them run their businesses. So if you have somebody who's very clever, and this is another story I have. In the earlier version, I talked about the difficulty of having an adhocracy, or now a project pioneer, as a division of a divisionalized company because of the measurements that don't work for project pioneers that might work for a machine organization. So a guy I knew who was the assistant to Jack Welch early on in his tenure as chief executive of General Electric came up to me and he said, well, we've got lighting, which is very machine-like, and we've got jet engines, which is more project-like. What should Welch do to differentiate them? And I said, well, do what you like about measuring the other ones, but let Welch designate the project organizations, the adhocracies, as his own sphere of influence, and keep the technocrats out of there, keep the controller out of there, keep the people who are measuring, keep the planners out of there. Let the people who are running project adhocracy type organizations the freedom to run those organizations free of the technocrats of headquarters.
Very much. So as we're coming slowly to the end, again, throughout the book, you have many interesting statements that relate directly to us as managers and what the insights that you bring us mean to us as the people managing and working in these organizations that you talk about. And near the end of the book, you make this statement. You say, the effectiveness of any organization depends on the management of contradiction. Could you elaborate a bit more on this idea of management of contradiction and why obviously it's important given the reality that you described for all of us?
Yeah, I call them the conundrums. That management is essentially dealing with conundrums. A conundrum is a problem you can't fix. It's going to be there. You can alleviate it, but you can't fix it. So the conundrum of planning. How can you plan ahead when the job of managing is so chaotic? That's out of my earlier book, but it's mentioned in this book as well. My book, Simply Managing, for everybody who wants to run out and buy it, God knows where it's gone. But anyway, there's another book called Simply Managing. That's funny. Don't know where it went. A book called Simply Managing has a whole chapter on the conundrums. How do you plan when everything is so chaotic in managerial work? And I don't mean strategic plan, I just mean plan ahead, think ahead. How do you bring things together? How do you bring things together when they're naturally apart? You have silos in organizations, and I also talk about slabs. Silos are like different functions, separate: marketing, finance, accounting, production, sales. And then you've got slabs, the C-suite, the managers, the different levels. And the slabs are as bad as the silos. The slabs block up, down, and the silos block lateral. But another conundrum is how do you manage, how do you coordinate things when they're so separated from each other? So they're arrogance. How do you have to be confident to be a manager. If you're not confident, if you're constantly running around saying, well, I don't know, and maybe it's this and maybe it's that, I'm not sure what's happening, and so on, drive people crazy. But if you're arrogant, I know best, and nobody's going to tell me what to do, you're over the edge. So how do you maintain confidence without slipping into arrogance? So these are all the conundrums that you have to manage, and I associate different conundrums with different forms. So the arrogance one would apply most obviously to the personal enterprise. Musk was presumably very confident in running Tesla. He's become totally arrogant in running Twitter. So different ones have different needs to different ways of managing. And I'm working on an article now to try and describe the nature of managerial work and the nature of strategy formulation or formation in the different forms. So, for example, in a personal form, strategy is about visioning. It's about creating a vision for the whole enterprise, which Steve Jobs was the master at. He had such a clear, sharp vision of what he was doing. It was amazing. And in the machine form, it's planning, but it's not strategic planning. It's more detailed planning. And in because the strategy is built in. And in the professional organization, it's about venturing. Everybody going off, trying, each surgeon, each physician in a hospital, each professor in the university, either alone or in small group, developing their own little strategies that add up to the strategy of the organization. And in the project organization, it's learning. You're constantly trying new things, and the organization learns from the projects that work best. So all that kind of gets worked together in the new book.
Thank you. And this leads me to perhaps a final thing I'd ask you to share a little bit about. For everybody who's listening, I am or was a student of Professor Mintzberg for several years, and I took my master's degree, which I got out of McGill University, through the IMPM program, which is an international master's program for practicing managers that you can do mid-career. And I'd just like to ask Henry if you could just share with everybody briefly what is this IMPM program. But before you do that, I'd like everyone to know, if you really want to understand these various things that Henry introduces in his books and his ideas, the managing contradictions, and you want to know how to do it yourself, you must consider obviously reading the book and going to one of Henry's programs. And this IMPM program, as an alumni, I hope all of you take a look at it. It is such an amazing program. So Henry, could you just briefly share with everybody, what is this IMPM program?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I used to go around bad-mouthing MBA programs that I claimed developed the wrong people in the wrong ways for the wrong reasons. Because you can't create a manager in a classroom. I think MBA programs, that's the book in the corner there. I think MBA programs are great for teaching business functions like marketing and finance, but you can't create a manager in a classroom. So people started to ask me, well, what are you doing about it? I'm not supposed to do anything about anything. I'm a professor, but I'm just supposed to criticize. But we created the IMPM, International Master's Program for Managers, IMPM.org, and later the IMHL.org, which is the same thing for healthcare managers. And it's in modules of about 10 days each, the IMPM, that goes around the world. So there's a module in England, then in Canada, then in India, in Japan, and in Brazil. And in between, the students do all kinds of things. But the key is that the participants are experienced managers, mid-career, typically 40s, and but many ages. And they sit at round tables so they can learn as much from each other in workshops as they learn from us in the whole classroom. And it's very innovative, all kinds of strange seating arrangements. We use keynote listeners beyond keynote speakers, and we do all kinds of things that are kind of wonderful. You can see on the website. But the idea is to train managers, not to create managers, but to take people who are managers, who understand what management is, and then can enhance their managerial capabilities. The healthcare program doesn't travel so much. This time it's going to be virtual. It doesn't travel so much. It's mostly, when it's live, it's mostly in Montreal or near Montreal. But it typically has people from 15 to 20 countries, and a very great mixture of all aspects of healthcare, all aspects of all countries of the world, all over the world, and all organizations in healthcare. So we get obviously hospital people, but we also get public health people. we get a few pharmaceutical people and all kinds of mixtures like that. They are the great joy for me to teach in. I teach in the first and second modules mostly. It's a great joy for me to teach because we learn as much from the participants, we don't call them students, but participants, as they learn from us. And the spirit of that is reflected, in case anybody forgot the name of the book. The spirit of that is reflected.
It really is.
In the book, and there's a little section on the IMPM there too.
Thank you. And so just to recap for everybody, if you are mid-career and you're interested in getting a Master's of Management degree, please consider the IMPM program. As an alumni, I cannot say enough good about it. It's really changed my life. For those that are looking, yes.
Just to add, impm.org and
right.
imhl.org.
Absolutely. And for those that are looking, that are perhaps not ready to make the leap to do a whole 2 years master's program, there are some other offshoots of the IMPM program. One in particular by a colleague of ours, Professor Gosling from Pelumbra, does a round table for practicing managers program that's a week long that you should consider as well. And lastly, as I mentioned, Professor Mintzberg and I started Coaching Ourselves to bring peer learning directly into the organization. So if you'd like to bring the concepts of Henry and some of the other thinkers directly to the managers in your organization in a peer learning approach, please consider Coaching Ourselves. We work with hundreds of large organizations around the world to set up peer learning groups that then work through various modules to develop themselves and develop their organization. And as Henry and I like to say, to change the practice of management.
Phil, just one thing. Do you have Jonathan's link for the?
They're putting the link into the chat, so everybody will see the link for these programs. So to end it all off, at the end of the book, Henry, you have this wonderful statement at the end. You said, quote, "I do hope this book has helped you liberate yourself from the orthodoxies of organizing so that you can design better organizations in the future." So do you have some perhaps final words of encouragement for anybody that's still on the edge, whether they're going to buy this book or not?
Well, maybe that will do it. Maybe your citing of that sentence will do it. I referred to a group of people who call themselves the Institution. So we need to think about institutions and not just institutions. But no, I'll let that stand for itself. So if that doesn't do it, maybe nothing can do it. Who knows?
Fair enough. So I'm just, Simon or whoever's listening, please make sure to put the link so that people can pre-order the book on the chat and these sorts of things. If you're interested, the book is coming out, I believe, in about 2 weeks. So it's not quite out, but if you pre-order it, that will be very, very good. So please just go to that link to pre-order the book. And it really, really is an amazing read. I strongly recommend it. And I want to thank you, Henry, for giving your time, for coming to talk to us about all of this. We will share the links to your TWOG, certainly pre-ordering the book. And for those that are interested, Henry has all sorts of work that he's done at rebalansingsociety.org and ourinterdependence.org, which are various projects that Henry is working on to talk to us about balance in society as opposed to just balance in organizations. Henry, it's wonderful to have this chance to share your thinking with everybody.
Thank you, Phil. Your support is always wonderful.
Very good. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all, everybody. Goodbye. Take care. This is the book. I know you can't see it.